probably don't know it, but the corporate supply chain is becoming a rich target for cyber attacks. Why that is, we discuss with Jennifer Bisigli, the CEO of Interos Solutions. That conversation includes touching on 5G, the Internet of Things, Facebook, blockchain, and much, much more. All that on this episode of Cocktail Investing. All right, welcome back, new listeners, welcome back, old listeners alike. It's once again time to distill the noise around us into clear investing signals. That means it's once again time for the Cocktail Investing Podcast. I'm Chris Versace, Tematica's Chief Investment Officer, and usually with me is Lenore Hawkins, Tematica's Chief Macro Strategist. But Lenore is off this week, so it's just me. But we've got something I would say extra special in mind for you guys, and in some cases, extra scary as well. Yeah, ever since we've had the podcast, we've talked, more than a few times about the various aspects that our safety and security investing theme has on everyday lives. This is the theme that talks about not just cyber attacks and cybersecurity, but personal security, as well as, of course, border security, not to mention, overall national defense spending and those types of things. So when we look at cybersecurity, some people might say, wow, it is growing. The investor would say that is a growth industry. We here at Tematica would say, yeah, it's a growth industry, but it's a pain point that creates a lot of demand. And that, obviously bodes well for a certain set of companies, hence our safety and security investment theme and that aspect of cybersecurity. Now, we would also say, though, as some of our disruptive technologies come along, 5G, for example, and the other resulting solutions like the Internet of Things, as well as the autonomous car that are going to be springing forth from that, we're more than likely going to see another step up in vulnerabilities, potential attacks, that sort of thing. Now, when it comes with cyber attacks, we tend to think of the direct recipient of the harm, whether that's the consumer or, the company that gets hacked. But as you'll hear today, a company's entire supply chain makes them vulnerable. That's right. And it means for a company to get a handle on its overall risk profile, it means assessing its suppliers as well. Now, let that sink in for a minute. All of its suppliers as well. Think about all those parts that are in your iPhone, your computer, your cable box, and where they might come from. Absolutely mind-blowing, isn't it? Here to talk with us today on this is Jennifer Bisigli from Interos Solutions. Jen's been in and around the supply chain management for 25 years or so and seen firsthand the number of changes and challenges that have come into play. From technology and cyber risks to geographic bad actors, Jen pulls the covers back on the growing number of threats to a company's supply chain. And along the way, we talk, like I said, 5G, the Internet of Things, as well as blockchain and even Facebook. For those looking for even more, in the text that accompanies this episode, we've provided some links, one to the Interos website, as well as Jen's recent congressional testimony. Be sure to check it out. It's something you're not going to want to miss. She testified before the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission hearing on China, the United States, and next generation connectivity. We're so happy to talk with Jen. So let's just get the conversation going with Jennifer Bisigli from Interos Solutions.
As I'm thinking about most of the listeners here, I think the big question is going to be, what the heck is the supply chain?
So it's a really great question. And I think that conversation has really broadened over the years, where we used to actually manufacture in a very linear fashion where you could actually see products and services being made in the back shop. Now we started offshoring our business relationships. So when we talk about risks in the supply chain, it's from any matter of relationship, whether it be a supplier, whether it be a business partnership, whether it be a distribution network. They're all different types of relationships and all places in the world that they come from, which is why it's a concern.
So let me just try and put this into simple context for the listener here. Most people have some Apple product, right? And Apple sources a lot of its stuff from various suppliers, whether it's chips, screens, what have you, and a lot of that gets assembled outside the U.S., I think particularly in China, which there might be some risk issues there. Is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly what we're talking about. So if you think about the example of a laptop, which has been quoted many, many times in many, many books and started in The World is Flat, where there are literally 400 different suppliers involved in making that one laptop that's in front of you. That's what we're talking about.
Wow. That seems like quite a bit of information to swallow.
It is. And it's quite a bit of information, not just to swallow, but to understand what's important in it, which is where the concept of supply chain risk management comes from. And what's important matters differently depending on where you are in those business relationships and what you're receiving and what you're shipping on to the next node in that supply chain.
So what you guys at Interos are doing is providing, like we like to say about ourselves, context and perspective and insight. Is that?
That's exactly right.
Okay. So I have to ask, though, even just stepping back, when I was reading up on you, you've been in the supply chain for 25 years, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what's the fascination with supply chain, and how have you seen it change over time?
So it's really a great question, and I think the fascination is...
Not every question is great.
I think that it's my Ronald Reagan, right? Pause. That's a great question. The fascination from a personal standpoint is the fact that it's never ending, and there's no way for it to be the same conversation with all different people. So every single time it's a different perspective because of how it affects you and where you are in the relationships.
Okay.
And I think the way that it's changed, and I give personal examples, when I started in the industry, again, you could literally see products and services being manufactured in the back room or on the shop floor.
Sure.
And I personally was instrumental in multiple organizations offshoring their manufacturing. And with one company that I worked with, we literally used to ship a guy with cash in his pocket to South America to make sure that the product, one, was being made to the quality specifications, and two, that the product actually made it back into the United States. So there I have quality concerns, I have intellectual property concerns, I have corruption and theft concerns. That guy had a great time because he had cash in his pocket and he was able to make deals, but it's not scalable or sustainable.
Right. And I imagine that as outsourcing grew and moved from country to country, there are various concerns, opportunities, risks that arose.
That's exactly right. And so you saw the conversation move from simple kind of quality to more physical security concerns. Again, we're more around theft and what's being packed into that box. And then it became even more tiered and more global, and more partners got involved. So now I have something called resiliency, which is making sure that that product actually gets where it's supposed to get to on time, based on mode of transportation, based on weather changes and hurricanes that it has to go through, based on port strikes, based on piracy, based on whatever that looks like. And then I think the final or the most recent manifestation is really around the 2007 timeframe, when cyber really became a hot topic. And now we've kind of fast forward in the Internet of Things, and we're all connected to each other, and information flow happens that much faster. And now people have access to our systems and to our things, and we don't even know who has a connection, because it's not the people that we know and that we're connected to, it's the people that they're connected to. And so what you've seen since 2007 is really a fast forward of the concerns of the relationships. Now I'm worried about tampered with product and malware, and again, intellectual property theft on a level that I never was before.
Let me just back up, because I think most people who are listening are going to go, yeah, I've heard about cyber attacks for the last 2 or 3 years, but you're saying 2007 is when it really became a focus.
So it probably became a focus before that, but around 2007 there was a greater awareness of what was happening that we needed to take action. So these things were happening, but I think in what I saw, what I experienced in my industry is 2007, almost we gave a name to it, for lack of a better term. And folks understood that in extended relationships, we couldn't just look at that relationship once as a handshake. Yes, I want to do business with you. We actually had to not just say, I want to do business with you, but how I want to do business with you outside of just normal contract terms. And then the concept of continuous monitoring really came up, which is, if you think about where business relationships started happening in the 90s, as we just talked about, when we started offshoring manufacturing, I just have a contract in place. I may have a 10-year relationship with you as a supplier. We never talked about the contract again. You just kept producing.
Right.
Now we have a concept of at least once a year, we need to check in to see what's changed in your business that might affect how we do business together. And then the idea of continuous monitoring, where we've taken it in Interos, is near real time, minute to minute, not just could our direct business relationship change, but your business relationship with your suppliers may change, and with their suppliers and their suppliers. Right. So the idea of continuous monitoring. So from a 2007 standpoint, we saw that the extended relationships were picking up based on the products we were buying from a technology standpoint. Kind of fast forward, now we're realizing it's not just an IT problem because everything is becoming intelligent. From your children's toys to your cars to the networks that you use from your routers.
So, I mean, we internally say, chips are the new fabric of our lives, not cotton anymore. But it sounds as if that as the world has become more connected, these problems just continue to grow or will continue to grow. And we're on the cusp of transitioning into some new technologies. In 2019 or so, 5G will go live, and that's probably going to bring a whole other set of issues as we have the connected car, the connected home, the Internet of Things, and whatever else.
That's exactly right. And I think there's a Gartner statistic that said by 2020, over 90% of what we buy is going to be hyper-connected. 5G just creates a faster avenue for that. And there are a lot of other concerns based on the countries that are involved in the standards of 5G that cause us in the United States a concern. But bigger picture, it's just realizing that everything that you come into touch with, that you buy, from your clothes, from wearable technologies, to the food in your refrigerator, to the heat in your house, everything is connected. And I think what you're seeing right now with Facebook is actually a perfect example.
I was going to save that till later, but what's your take on what's going on with Facebook?
So personally, I'm surprised that everyone's so surprised.
Why do you say that? Because I think most people kind of sit back and they go, oh, I'm just going on Facebook. I'm posting stuff. I'm connecting with my friends, putting up photos, maybe funny photos, commenting, something like that.
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting discussions out there is what's being commonly called business ethics right now. But this whole idea of big data, we're starting to accumulate so much information. It's almost like the wild, wild west, in that we're accumulating so much into single places that we don't know how to protect it, if it needs to be protected. And if we collect it for one reason, for example, you have something, a Fitbit or something on your shoe that is watching how fast you run, and oh, by the way, it picks up that you're about to have a heart attack. Should it have to automatically connect to 911? It should have just housed that information.
Right.
And so this idea of business ethics, which is a bit of what I would look at what's happening with Facebook, is that when they started Facebook as a platform, did they even know that they had a responsibility? Because the conversation wasn't there.
Yeah, my view on that is if you look at the growth in Facebook, both from a size, whether it's employees, revenues, or even the areas that they touch, they have had very rampant growth over the last 5 to 10 years. And, they probably were not anticipating some of these things.
I don't think anybody was.
Yeah.
So hindsight's a beautiful thing.
Sure.
And that's a bit of what we're governing them with. Having said this personally, Chris, I don't even have a Facebook account for exactly this reason.
Yeah.
And so I think that, we have been very trusting, and we do this as human nature. And again, another case in point, I was in, an Apple store, and I was waiting for my phone to be fixed or for a battery issue. And I was listening to one of the schools that they have there. And they were literally teaching this couple in their 80s where their healthcare information was on their phone. And I'm sitting there listening to that. And as you know, there's a lot of concern about our healthcare records and the electronic record and the protection of that. Yet we have a commercial provider thinking they're doing a favor to the consumer by collecting all their information because of how our medical system has become so distributed. So in that situation, who's to say who's right and wrong? I mean, it's certainly not me, but it's what I'm comfortable with.
Right. Which is, and not to get too off topic, but I think the issue is Apple being one who would rather have you opt in several times, whereas Facebook, it's kind of, you got to opt out.
So I absolutely agree with you. I would offer to you that this conversation is exactly germane to the risk in the supply chain.
All right, let's hear it.
In the simple fact that now you have suppliers that, because of their connection to Facebook, have access to information that we might not have given to them on purpose. It's the exact same situation. If you look at what happened to Target in 2014, I would offer to you that was a supply chain issue. If you had asked them 2 weeks before they were breached who was in their supply chain,
Mm-hmm.
they would have gone for the logistics answer. They would have told you that it was the physical, the sheets and towels that get put on their shelves so that you and I buy it. Now they have an understanding. It's the business relationships they had. It's the service providers they use. It's the suppliers they're sourcing from. And so for the folks that are listening to this, hopefully they leave with a broadening understanding of the questions to be asked about what really matters. So if we look at simple like mergers and acquisitions,
Mm-hmm.
there's a larger understanding now that I can't just look at the company that I'm looking to buy.
Well, think of Verizon and Yahoo, right? That
Absolutely.
example. That's probably a great example of what you're talking about.
Well, so that is absolutely a great example, and it's a cyber example, and I'll give you a different spin because more people will start thinking about cyber.
Mm-hmm.
But we had an example of a company in the United Kingdom that was purchased by a company in Italy because they were a natural augmentation to what was being provided there,
Mm-hmm.
and that's fine. To the United States, that was two friendly countries. And then when we did some due diligence, we actually found out that the Italian company in Italy, actually had a large-scale investment from an unfriendly country.
Oh.
So, and it happened in the 12 months right prior to the acquisition. Now I'm starting to think, as somebody watching this on the outside, did they do the investment because they knew the acquisition was going to happen, whether they knew it on purpose on paper or they just thought that the market was primed for it,
Mm-hmm.
so that they could have undue influence and have access to not just the intellectual property, but the consumer base or the tiers of consumer bases. That's what we're talking about. And so we're seeing across the board, whether it be food consolidation, whether it be technology, you were looking at a merger in a major utility company. You're concerned about the electric grid. You're concerned about consumer safety. There's all these things. This is what we talk about with the risks in the supply chain.
So I hear that on one hand. I think it makes perfect sense. On the other hand, I wonder, how do you sleep at night?
Well, I don't eat a lot after I found out what happens in the food supply chain. It's a scary, scary thing.
I believe that. So you had said a few minutes ago that you would hope that the listeners would come across with a better understanding of the questions that need to be asked.
Right.
What are some of those questions?
So I think that if I'm looking at engaging with a new supplier or even my current supplier,
Mm-hmm.
it's the questions of how do they know what within their organization needs to be protected. So we've kind of crossed the chasm over the last 3 to 5 years where we used to do something called risk transference. And we do this a lot in mergers and acquisitions and business due diligence, which
Mm-hmm.
is we say you're either good or bad because of how you do business. And now we're understanding that everybody does business differently, and it could still give us the means to the same end. But we have to say, okay, I first look at myself and I say, I'm in the food industry, and these are the 5 things I care about in my business. And we call them mission essential functions, or they could be in the 10 Ks of a public company. But these are the things that cause risk to my mission or my organization. Once I outline those, then I look at each of my business relationships. So not just my logistical suppliers, but my business relationships. So I don't care if it's the person doing your HVAC system maintenance. I don't care if it's your auditor on your books, or I don't care if it's somebody that's providing product or services to do your mission build-up. It's literally organization's mission build-up. It's literally who am I doing business with, from business partnerships, suppliers, and other distributing relationships. And what part of my organization's business bottom line mission would get interrupted if something that they did caused me harm?
Mission critical.
Mission critical.
Okay.
And so when I do that, now I'm able to prioritize how to look at those relationships based on the impact. And then I have that same conversation with my tier 2, which is my next tier supplier, and ask them how they're doing that with the next tier suppliers.
And how far down do you go?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Chris. And we deal with, because we work both in the public and the private sector, we deal with some organizations that want to take it. We have a current program right now that we're taking it to the 6th tier. We've had in the past dealt with organizations that take it to the 12th tier. If you were to ask me, having been in the industry for 25 some years, I would offer to you that past the 2nd or 3rd tier, I wouldn't bother. And the reason for that is because unless you are paying for the product to be specifically made, like you mentioned chips,
Yep.
There were actually organizations that were paid a lot of money to create chips in a safe environment, so we knew where they came from because of what they were being used for. Most of what we're talking about is commercial. And in the commercial global supply chain, it's dynamic and constantly changing. And so in that, unless I want to assume the cost because the consequence is too great, I'm not going to bother to try to control further down in the second or third. And the whole idea, and being in this realm for so long, the whole idea is that your security posture actually goes up with the more you push back on the supply chain because everyone takes ownership in it. You don't have to get prescriptive. You don't have to tell them how to do it. You just need to tell them what matters, what consequence you're trying to avoid.
Right.
So whether it be consumers getting sick, somebody getting hurt, child labor concerns, weather concerns, whatever those concerns are, once you explain to your next tier what you're concerned about, then they should right size it to their supplier base and say what could be passed off from then as well. So to answer your question, I think past the second or third tier is a waste of time and money unless you have a very specific example and are willing to own the cost.
Okay. So, I mean, that, of course, springs a whole host of questions. The first one being, it sounds like, I think most people would think of manufacturing, right? You have a supply chain, you're manufacturing goods, you have parts that you assemble, that sort of thing. But that's not the case. It's actually across a number of industries that you're talking, if not all of them.
All of them. There is, I can't think, except again, in some very high cost, low risk areas. So for example, we deal with space programs. Mm-hmm. They have a very short supply chain and it's very well controlled because their risk tolerance is zero. Having said that, you have more of a growth in the commercial sector because of the opportunity and the competition in the supply chain.
Right.
And so you're seeing a more extended supply chain.
Well, let me ask you about one, because in again, getting ready to talk to you, I noticed that you guys talk a little bit about financial services and banking. Mm-hmm. And I think to the average person, they would be like, what's the supply chain? I deal with the bank.
Yep.
So just walk us through that real quick.
So it's all about technology in the supply chain. And if you look at the bank's relationships, probably, and I'm just going to pull a number, so north of 80% of a bank's relationships is all technology. And it's global.
And what do you mean technology?
So technology as in your money, they're not literally passing dollars around necessarily, right. Physical dollars.
Bitcoins, right?
That's a whole nother topic. But the whole idea is these are electronic transfers. So they're going through routers and switches and using computers to update markets and other computers and banks around the world. And if you think about where you do your banking, a lot of us do it from our home computer. So you think about your home computer.
Or your smartphone.
Or your smartphone, absolutely. So there's two examples, right? So you think about your home computer. Chances are it goes from your computer through your wireless router at home and off to a bank you can't see.
Correct.
The banks are doing it exactly the same way. Your mobile phone, it's either doing it off of the network that you know that you hook up to or off of the cellular service that you don't know what you're hooking up to. Same exact transactions. And so it's literally a handoff of electrons to electrons, and you really have no idea, based on when you hit send from your phone, who has access to that information.
I liken it to depositing cash at the ATM, right? There's a lot of faith on your part that it's going to go through, it's going to be credited, and everything will be okay.
There is, so the answer is you're exactly right. I will say that the financial sector is probably more forward-leaning because they realized years ago that they don't have the physical touch, so they can't see and control. So there's been a lot more, and they did come under more of that cyber discussion. There's been a lot more discussion in the financial sector, but I'll also tell you we're talking to many organizations in the financial sector because they went so heavy on classic cyber, which looked at concerns on their networks and really not about where they're sourcing the products, the routers, and the lines that make up their networks.
Interesting.
And that's the supply chain.
Okay. For them. Okay. Is there, and you said all industries.
All industries. There is, I honestly, I can't think of any industry one that I personally haven't worked in, all the way from CPG to automotive to healthcare to pharma to ammunitions. Infrequently, not never, but infrequently is the one that produces a final good, the tier one.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. Is there any industry or group of industries that are at the forefront of this?
Excuse me. So I think the two that I would call out is the financial sector that we just talked about. And again, the positive for them is they don't have as much physical stuff.
Right.
The negative to them is they really can't see and touch what it is, right? Because it's all electronic.
Right. But I mean, it sounds to me like you mentioned routers and things like
Sure.
that. It seems to me then that they've got to be understanding who's manufacturing their equipment.
Right, and that's what the conversations that we're having now, because it's not just the OEM, the original manufacturer. It's the folks that they're sourcing.
Oh, they're
from.
ODM, they're their suppliers. So it's like, I don't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
No, please.
But if it's it's understanding that you might be buying a product from Apple, but if you look on the back of your phone, it says designed by Apple in California, manufactured in China.
Right.
What is going on inside of that Foxconn warehouse? And who are they buying their components from and all that? Or Cisco and the routers. Who's actually, whose chips are in that? Whose other, hardware is going into that box?
Well, it's that, and it's also how does it get to you? So, infrequently is Foxconn shipping directly to you, and Cisco certainly doesn't ship directly to you.
No.
They all go through value-added resellers.
Right.
And the big question from several organizations is what type of value-added happens when they go through these,
Right.
and what type of checks and balances.
What's part of that touch? Are they adding something, whether it's physical hardware or software?
Exactly.
Okay.
I would offer to you to answer your question. The second forward leaning is around pharmaceuticals, because if you look globally, it's one of the most counterfeited things with apparel. And if you look at, and I'll just pick a country like India, I think I saw a statistic in the last few years that only 1/3 of pharmaceuticals going into India were real, were authentic. 2/3 were counterfeit. And so the United States actually created a pharma law that said if you wanted to actually sell pharmaceuticals in several of the states, you had to produce what they call pedigree. So tracking,
Well, that's
all the way back to when things were sand.
That's a great point to bring up, because I'm sitting here and as you're describing this, I'm thinking, and it's not like a good housekeeping seal of approval, but is there some checklist, some approved list that, whether it's a company that wants to be in very good standing, or an investment bank is coming in to do their due diligence, or another company is coming in to do their due diligence on an M&A transaction, that a company can go, see here's our piece of paper. We have done this due diligence. We've done this audit. We get whatever grade we get, and we've been working on it to improve our grade.
Right. So the answer is really no. There's a more of an understanding that we need that. I will tell you that the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, has a special pub out there, 800-161, that comes about as close as you'll get to what you just said. And it says pretty much for any industry, here's a vanilla version of what a good supply chain risk management plan looks like. The challenge, in my opinion, again, is that those standards get us to a certain place, but this is really operational risk, because it's industry and it changes constantly, and you want it to change constantly, because if not, you don't get innovation, you don't get best prices, you don't get competition, all those other things. So there's a delicate balance between trying to control it through some sort of compliance, which is what you start getting into when you look at standards, versus really understanding how all the different hops are doing business. And in reality, just like anything else, you can only control yourself. So if I constantly look at my risk, my security posture, and what I'm willing and able to accept, then I look at my business relationships and where they may impact me. Those are the conversations I have to have. And in my experience across any industry, there's no real rule book yet. We've moved from the government's the GRC tools, I think government's regulatory and compliance tools, which had a role, and it came out of Sarbanes-Oxley. But again, that's more about compliance checklist versus really what we're talking about, which is who do you want to do business with? What are you willing to accept? Case in point, one of your large athletic organizations, companies, actually decided to offshore to China, and then got very, very frustrated that they had a bunch of counterfeit product running around with their emblem on it. And you have to understand that, and not to pick on China because there are other countries, but China literally has a political and economic strategy that they can't separate, because that's how they run their country, that says that they will take your intellectual property if you decide to manufacture there. That's part of doing business in China.
Part of the deal.
And we all act surprised, kind of back to the Facebook point, we all act surprised when this happens that there's counterfeits running around, but you made a risk trade-off.
So let me ask you use that to bring up another point, and I think this is something that you talked about when you testified for the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. you were talking about 5G, and you were
Yes.
talking about in the past 2G, 3G companies historically, even 4G, Qualcomm, Nokia, Ericsson, the traditional technology developers for wireless. But with 5G, there's some new entrants that are coming in. Huawei, ZTE, for example. And I'm just thinking about what you're saying. If you've got, wireless products, hardware, software, infrastructure that other companies are having sourced, either components or assembled in China, maybe that helps explain how Huawei, ZTE, and others are able to get up the learning curve. But they're looking to compete in the 5G standards bodies. Now, while that might, help bring about lower costs, there's a security concern over there. In the U.S., for example, Huawei has tried to lead in the U.S. for some time, and there's a lot of security issues that have been raised time and time again. But in your testimony, you're saying there's a lot more than that. Yes?
A lot more companies or a lot more concerns?
Yes and yes.
Yeah, so there is. And so you're right, there is yes and yes. So I got a Peloton, and
do you like it?
I love it. I bought it 6 weeks ago. I literally used it every single day, except for obviously when I was on travel and just 2 days that I couldn't.
Yeah, I haven't tried it. My partner, Chris Broussard, has tried it out a couple times. I think he likes that idea of being able to join a class anytime.
I love it. And the reason I even brought it up is because the instructor that I like literally says the answer to her question, every question about how do you want to go harder, is yes and yes. So that's what made me think of it. But to the point of why we're here today.
What's that second yes?
Well, there's no. It's yes and yes. That's kind of how I run my business these days. The answer is yes and yes. Back to the question of
5G.
Yes, well, two things. One is that China's not the United States' only problem, and it's not any country's only problem. There are other countries that do business by taking your intellectual property.
Right.
And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that the concern of, it's not the concern of 5G or developing technologies. The concern with 5G at the hearing was much more around the standards that you just asked about.
Now, why is that?
Because China is taking a forward lean on creating the standards.
So is India, for that matter.
And so the point of this is twofold, in my opinion, and this is not meant to be political, but this is Jennifer.
No, go right ahead.
Is that one, the United States, if we're not comfortable with another country setting standards, then we should get more vocal and help set the standards.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was really one of the positive outcomes from the commission, from the hearing, was that the commissioners all agreed that we needed to get more active and involved so that we could help control our own destiny.
Right.
The second thing is 5G by itself, again, is not the problem. We want innovation. We want faster technology. Mm-hmm. It's the world we live in.
Yep.
We want faster refreshes. We want innovation. But again, it's understanding, to the point of that you shared, is where's stuff coming from and where's it going to and who has access to it in between. And maybe I look at this very simplistically, Chris, but to me that's the same problem we had in the 90s. It's just hyper speed now because so much of it's electronic.
Yeah, it's a different mode.
It's a very much a different mode. And to me, that's all 5G is it's just one more innovation. It's not the first and it's not the last.
Well, right. So with any technological change, you might have a new suppliers might emerge, other suppliers might fade away, but you still got the same questions that are being asked.
Well, you do, and you don't have an answer. And so I think the bigger question, and as Gartner mentioned where we're going, and we can see it, I actually had a conversation with a senator not too long ago about he wanted to really have some protocols around toys because of the big concern that all of the kids' toys now are electronic. Mm-hmm. And so not just can the parents see when the kid's sleeping, but anybody can hack into it and see when the kids are sleeping. And I get that, and that's a very emotional thing to go after. I'll be honest with you, when I walk down the street, my larger concern is the regulation and control around driverless cars. And you saw what just happened with that.
Yes.
And so it's not just does the technology work the way it's supposed to, but what happens when somebody gets access to that technology and does something that it wasn't supposed to?
Well, I was thinking about that as 5G is going to be the bedrock for a number of new innovations. Right. Autonomous cars is one of those. And it seems that as that connectivity speed expands,
right,
and we have even more computing power inside the device, that your job to do this due diligence, the number of potential suppliers just continues to expand.
It continues to expand, and the hyperconnectivity of not just them expanding, but how quickly, not that they just get engaged, but how quickly they switch, it's going to be rampant. And so what we do here is we're trying to work with our customers, not just to say, give me a list of suppliers I'm concerned about, but literally understanding the assurance of their ecosystem. So really looking at the multiple tiers of relationships, where does the concern come from, and focusing on that. Because if I can't answer that question, I'm never going to raise my security posture.
So just a couple questions. From your perspective, there's 5G, there's Internet of Things. Any one scarier than the other?
I think one enables the other.
Right, but is one scarier than the other?
No.
So they're both scary?
So they're both scary, and they both need to be looked at, in my opinion, in the same way.
Okay.
Right? So the Internet of Things, the smart cities that we're going into, all they are, one's a mechanism to get to the other, and all they do is one connects everybody, and one is just the speed of access.
Okay. What about, there's a lot of talk, I joked about Bitcoin earlier, but how does blockchain fit into all this?
So I keep hedging on not wanting to say it's a really great question, but you're asking good questions, Chris. So
that's my job. That's what I get paid for.
So again, been in the industry for a long time. Blockchain, to me, has a role. I will tell you that I've seen it before in different ways. And the whole idea here of blockchain is to get a snapshot, a point-in-time update of where things are.
Right.
And so I think, again, there's a use right now, instead of doing it on pen and paper, and we used to do it through what was called EDI, or advanced ship notices. Now we're doing it through blockchain because that's where technology is right now. So I think it has a role, but I will tell you that everybody we've talked to about blockchain understands where we're coming from, which is, that's great. Now I know that it hit this node, it scanned into this warehouse, it scanned onto this ship, it left this warehouse, whatever that is. But what's happening to it when it's in transit, what's happening to it around it, and oh, by the way, who are all the other entities that are interacting with it? That's where the cause of concern is.
Yeah, I kind of look at it like if I order something from, just say, Amazon, I know that it's been through Kentucky and these other things. I get the alerts, but I have no idea if it's been dropped, it's been kicked, if the box is broken.
And who picked it up, and who's delivering it to you, and who else that they were delivering stuff for, and all those other business relationships that really cause the concern. So blockchain is almost like a good point-in-time affirmation of something.
Right.
It's not what we're talking about here, which is the cause of concerns around security.
Right.
Because in my opinion, it's not a security necessarily a solution for security.
Okay. All right. And you mentioned earlier that you work with public and private companies?
Yes.
Okay. And I know that in reading up on you guys, you deal with a lot of three-lettered agencies.
Yes.
Are they any further ahead than the commercial side?
So I think the interesting thing about, if you look at the public versus the private sector, is that they all have different lenses that they look through at the same problem set. And I don't know that I would see, if you looked at a pure maturity model, I wouldn't say that.
Whoa, what?
Sorry, wrong audience. If you looked at a capability model, a maturity model that said where you are from beginning to end as far as really having a solid supply chain risk management program, I don't know that they're any further ahead. I think they might, as a whole, as a comprehensive program, I think they might be further ahead in different positions because of how they started.
Okay. So
if you look at from a national security concern, agencies that are concerned about that are probably further along from a threat intelligence aspect than you would find for somebody making sneakers in the private sector. But the private sector probably has a better feel for who their multi-tiered suppliers are because either their supply chain is shorter and or they've been asking those questions for years. So I think each one of them has pluses and minuses. But what we have seen is that on both sides of the public-private sector, there's still a ways to go. Okay.
And are there, as you talk to companies, whether it's, your peers in the C-suite or boardroom people, we hear about cybersecurity, cyber attacks, that it's increasingly becoming a board level item. How many boards do you talk to that go, I hear what Jen is saying, I get it, we need to do this, we need to assign a point person, just like with cybersecurity, or enhance that role? Or is it kind of like, yeah?
So I would tell you, if you had asked me this 3 years ago, it would have been the latter.
Right.
I would tell you that now, and again, looking at statistics out there, that the C-suite, over almost 50% of them by the end of 19 are going to say this is one of their top 3 concerns.
Okay.
Because they're realizing that cyber is not necessarily a be-all, end-all state to be solved right now. It's an attack vector. It's a location. Yeah. It's technology. And how we communicate, it's not the problem set. The problem set is literally, again, where's stuff, whether it be product or services or information, coming from, going to, and who has access to it along the way.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at cybersecurity inside of Tematica as a part of something, that's part of our safety and security. And I think that's what you're talking about, is how does a company make sure that it is safe and secure?
That's exactly right.
Okay. I'm just trying to think. There was... seeing companies get proactive is good. So I don't know if you've run across any data or if you have any internal thoughts on this, but it sounds like we're going to see more spending towards not only these types of solutions, but overall in safety and security type spending. You mentioned by 19, probably going out a few years. So you don't see any slowdown in this.
I don't see any slowdown. And I think back to your last question, because the conversation, when we used to talk about supply chain risk management, it used to get very confused with, again, the logistics aspect of an organization. So if you can imagine to the financial sector talking to the C-suite about, they don't have anything real physical, so they're not thinking about it.
Well, I could see, to your point, I could see 3 years ago people going, why we got to worry about our routers?
Exactly. Well, it was even more than that. They didn't understand that it was the information transport that was the problem. They literally thought this was the warehouse responsibility, and the trucks and the planes. And because, again, it's supply chain.
Right.
And so what you've seen is the advance of an understanding that we're all hyper-connected to each other. And supply chain, right or wrong, just happens to be the term for it.
Okay.
And so I certainly don't see a slowdown. And in fact, what we're seeing is a merger of the conversation, where this used to be, cyber was an add-on. We're seeing that folks realize that cyber fits up underneath a supply chain risk management comprehensive plan that's actually fitting into a larger enterprise risk management plan.
Got it. That makes perfect sense. So as you look around the landscape, are you across your competitors, are you seeing traditional defense companies kind of get a little more aggressive in the cyberspace, maybe into supply chain?
Well, they absolutely are, and I would offer to you that the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA, that was passed last year, made them. So there are specific laws that when you're a defense contractor, that you have to not just manage it, but alert people when things happen to you. And the idea of this was to kind of get some of the litigious concerns out of the way, because in the past when folks got breached, they were afraid to tell anyone because they were afraid contracts would get canceled, or worse, they'd be sued.
Well, we've heard that, several times over the last, 12 to 18 months with companies like Equifax. Yeah. Like, we were hacked way back when, we're only telling you now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm not saying, so it's not solved and there's no silver bullet. And I think what we've seen and why it's so important that, when we work with our customers, it's really understanding what you're concerned about and what the consequence you're concerned about. So again, not to get political, but I'm not a big fan of blacklisting whole countries because I believe, since we're a global economy, that when you blacklist them in one area, something else pops out someplace else.
Just a shift.
It's exactly right. And so that's pretty much what we're seeing in the private sector.
Okay. Well, Jen, let me ask you a question. You've been very kind with your time thus far, and I really appreciate it. This is a heavy topic, an important topic. But what I'm wondering is there anything that companies in particular lean on Interos for? Like, what's your core product, key product? What are you well known for? Your signature dish, if you will.
Yeah, we're known for 3 main things. The first, as I mentioned to you, really working with our customers to give them some awareness and ecosystem assurance. So even though they think they may know who their suppliers are, they really only normally know the ones they're dealing with that are signing the contract. They truly don't know who they're doing business with, especially from a technology.
The army underneath.
The army underneath, and again, especially as a technology, You have a lot of value-added resellers and distributors. The same thing in healthcare is a big situation as well, that you really have no idea where you're sourcing things from or how many hops it goes through. So Interos has this concept of ecosystem assurance where we actually visualize what those relationships look like. And what we've shown time after time are two things: interdependencies that you didn't know were there, as well as some unknown vulnerabilities that are caused because of that. The second thing is once you understand who the tiers are and who's in those tiers of supply chains, now we can understand who causes the darker consequence. And so now we help you prioritize or do another set of tiers of those different suppliers and do deeper assessments. So looking at lagging indicators of what's happened in the past, because as much as we like to think that we're all unique, we're humans and humans like patterns. And so what Interos is able to do is take those business relationships, look what's happened in the past through an assessment, and really focus on continuous monitoring and predictive insights. Because the idea, and it can be across industries, is if we saw suppliers act in this way in the automotive industry, and we see suppliers act the same or similar way in the pharmaceutical industry, we saw the consequence in the automotive, we can predict what's going to happen in the pharmaceutical.
I think the legal term is you're following the fact pattern.
Exactly.
Okay. And, I'm sure my last question before I turn it to you, so to speak, is I'm hearing all this. And as I listen to you, it seems pretty obvious to me that the average investor would be wise to own some aspect of our safety and security theme. There could be certain companies out there. Maybe they could simply own the ETF hack. That's a basket of cybersecurity companies. But from your perspective, what's the one or two things you would say, hey, Mr. Ms. Investor, think about this? What would that be?
So the first thing would be asking the organizations that they're looking to invest in, what are they doing around their supply chain? And not just what are they doing, but what have they found? Because again, 12 months ago, it was show me your supply chain risk management plan, and it was a piece of paper and it was a compliance activity.
Right.
Everybody's getting hit, everybody's getting impacted, and it's okay. And back to the question before, is it's okay, but it's what are you doing about it and who are you sharing that with? And at least you should be sharing with the people that could be negatively impacted as well. So the first thing is to say, what are you doing as far as your supply chain risk management plan? And how are you enforcing that, and what's actually happened? And how are you ensuring your tier twos?
Well, it's interesting you say that because Apple publishes a list of its suppliers every year. Yeah. And what's always interesting about that is to see not only who's added, but who fell off.
Right. And there's probably a backstory to all of that that we may or may not know what's happening. And we've seen that, and there's several suppliers that consider their supplier, there's several companies that feel that their supplier list is intellectual property. I'm a big fan of, you can put it out there or at least share it with the folks that are being impacted by it. Mm-hmm. But, to me, again, that's commercial information. And you don't, in no situation, unless you're willing to pay for it and the consequence is too great, again, space systems, nuclear stockpile concerns, national security concerns. Do I really want to own that tiered information? Because it does change so quickly. And you want to let the commercial, the economy do what it needs to do. I will share with you, to the question that you just asked, that we actually were working with an investor probably 8-10 years ago that literally put together a fund based on manufacturers, so retailers, and looked at how well that fund did against other ones. And the ones that were part of a round table that actually put together supply chain risk management plans and paid attention to it and resourced it actually outperformed the other funds. And so it's been proven it's a good business decision. And that's all we're talking about. When you're talking about security, I'd offer to you that what we've seen is the conversation has turned in the last 3 years from a gotcha situation and a contractual to information sharing. And we're all trying to get better in a world where somebody's trying to get at all of us. And the closer we can work together, the more that all boats rise.
Yeah, I mean, we've had people on before where they talk about, the evolution in cybersecurity, cyber attacks, as cyber attacks in particular are a moving target. And it just seems that if, to your point, people are collaborating and the information's out there, you might actually be able to catch the bad guys or ward them off a little sooner.
Yep, so absolutely. And so you saw just in this DC area, last year, the ransomware at the hospital systems, if they had shared, how much would that have benefited them all?
Well, I mean, to your point, I think over the weekend there was some news story on CNBC where it might have been a hospital or some other entity was hijacked and they were told, well, you got to pay in Bitcoin.
Right.
And that story it broke almost immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully things are, accelerating. Last thing, you've been gracious with your time. Anything we didn't talk about or anything you want to turn back on us?
So I think that kind of in summary, if you
Sure.
don't mind, is that...
No. You're going to save me from having to do it. Be my guest.
I think that what we're seeing for the investors that are listening, what we're seeing is that the ones that are actually seeing benefit in this world of a global economy is they're not trying to control it. They have a strategy around it. They have check-ins. I don't like to use the word audit because it makes people uncomfortable, but they have check-ins, and they've really learned how to change the conversation with their business partners and their suppliers to make this a very healthy situation. Because again, you talk about Equifax or Target or whoever, the hospital systems, it's happening to all of us.
Right.
It's happening to us personally. It's happening to corporations. And so in a world where this is happening, how do we change that conversation so we can share, so we can increase the security of the relationship, which just, then they tell a friend and they tell a friend and they tell a friend, security goes up and costs go down.
Right. So it sounds as if companies have had that wake-up call, and this latest thing with Facebook is just maybe a reminder.
Personal opinion is that I think that there's a wake-up call for some reason that I still see a lot of organizations need it to happen to them first in effort to spend the resources.
Right.
And I would offer to you that what I've seen is that this business ethics or how are we using the information has been out there. I think Facebook really, in my opinion, impacted people more personally and their homes and their kids. There was one of the services was at Yelp that was looking at ads on children, and you actually had to turn off or on, like a human actually turn off or on what the kids could see versus machines doing it automatic. So you're seeing this in all different services. And so I don't know what Facebook's going to tilt. It might tilt privacy from a personal standpoint.
Yeah, I think Zuckerberg is supposed to speak before Congress. And I think what I've read and heard is they are potentially opening themselves up to some regulation.
But it's an industry that hasn't had it.
Exactly right.
And probably needs it, but never took a pause. And again, that's why I use the term the wild, wild west. And after them, it's going to be somebody else because it's not like it's a singular event.
Jen, thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully we can have you back as things emerge when we start seeing these 5G networks, IoT goes real.
We look forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you.